A cashier helps a struggling elder and gets fired. Next day, mysterious men in suits and dark sunglasses knock on her door. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Your story starts now. The fluorescent lights of Greenwood Supermarket buzzed overhead as Dorothy Manning stood at her register, her feet aching after a long day of scanning groceries and bagging produce. At 24, she felt much older, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her narrow shoulders. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, wisps escaping to frame her tired face. Despite her exhaustion, her hazel eyes remained alert, scanning the faces of customers as they approached her checkout line. It was nearing the end of her shift when she noticed him, an elderly gentleman shuffling towards the adjacent register. His weathered hands clutched a small basket, containing a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a few vegetables. Dorothy watched as he placed his items on the conveyor belt, his movements slow and deliberate. As the cashier began scanning his groceries, the old man reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins. His fingers trembled as he started counting, his face growing redder by the second. Dorothy's heart clenched as she saw the shame in his downcast eyes. Behind him, a line was forming. A businesswoman tapped her foot impatiently, while a mother with 2 young children sighed loudly. The old man's shoulders hunched further as he became aware of their scrutiny. Dorothy's attention was drawn back to her own line as a customer, approached, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. As she scanned items and processed payments, her gaze kept drifting back to the elderly man. She watched as he separated his groceries, pushing aside the vegetables and keeping only the bread and milk. The defeat in his posture was palpable, and Dorothy felt a lump form in her throat. Without thinking, she closed her register and stepped over to the adjacent checkout. "Sir," she said softly, touching the old man's arm, "please take all of your groceries." The man looked up, his watery blue eyes meeting hers. I can't afford them all," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Dorothy smiled gently. "It's all right. I've got this." She pulled out her own debit card and swiped it through the machine, paying for the remainder of his groceries. The old man's eyes widened in disbelief. "Young lady, I can't let you do that," he protested weakly. "Please," Dorothy insisted. "I want to help." She began bagging his groceries, including the vegetables he had set aside. As she handed him the bags, the old man's eyes welled with tears. "God bless you, my child," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "What's your name?" "Dorothy," she replied, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the gratitude in his eyes. "I'm Franklin," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "Thank you, Dorothy. You have no idea what this means to me." As Franklin shuffled away, leaning heavily on his cane but standing a little straighter, Dorothy felt a sense of satisfaction that outweighed her exhaustion. She returned to her register, unaware that her simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. What she did notice, however, was the hard stare of her supervisor, Mr. Reeves, from across the store. The satisfaction she had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. As their eyes met, Mr. Reeves beckoned her with a sharp gesture. Dorothy swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She knew that look. It spelled trouble. Dorothy's heart pounded as she made her way across the store, weaving between shelves, stocked with colorful packages and produce. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, casting stark shadows that mirrored the dread growing within her. Mr. Reeves stood by the door to the manager's office, his arms crossed over his chest. At 45, he had the perpetual look of someone who had bitten into a lemon, his thin lips pressed into a tight line of disapproval. "In here, Dorothy," he said, his voice clipped as he opened the door. Inside the cramped office, the store manager, Mr. Lawrence, sat behind a cluttered desk. At 60, he was a man who seemed to have been born old, his face a map of deep-set wrinkles and his eyes small and shrewd behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Sit down," Mr. Lawrence said, gesturing to the uncomfortable plastic chair in front of his desk. Dorothy lowered herself into the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The air in the office felt thick and oppressive, laden with unspoken accusations. Mr. Lawrence leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "Dorothy, do you know why you're here?" She nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She knew exactly why she was here, but a small part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. "What you did out there," Mr. Lawrence continued, his voice low and controlled, "was completely unacceptable. You know that's against company policy." Dorothy found her voice, small though it was. "But, sir, he was an elderly man who couldn't afford his groceries. I was just trying to help." Mr. Reeves scoffed from where he stood by the door. "Help? You think this is a charity, Dorothy? This is a business." "Exactly," Mr. Lawrence agreed, his eyes narrowing. "We can't have employees deciding to donate products to customers. Where would it end? We'd be out of business in a week." "But it wasn't donation," Dorothy protested, her voice growing stronger as she fought for understanding. "I paid for it myself, with my own money." "That's not the point," Mr. Lawrence snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The point is, you undermined our policies. You made a decision that wasn't yours to make." Dorothy felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry, not here, not now. "I was just trying to do the right thing," she said softly. Mr. Lawrence's expression softened for a moment, almost imperceptibly. Then it hardened again. "Sometimes, Dorothy, the right thing in your heart isn't the right thing for a business. We have protocols in place for a reason." There was a long pause, during which Dorothy could hear her own heart beating in her ears. She knew what was coming, but that didn't make it any easier when Mr. Lawrence finally spoke again. "I'm sorry, Dorothy, but we're going to have to let you go." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. But I've worked here for 3 years," she stammered, hating how weak her voice sounded. "I've never been late, never called in sick. I always pick up extra shifts when you need me to." Mr. Lawrence shook his head. "And we appreciate that. But this isn't about your work ethic, Dorothy. It's about following rules and understanding your place in this company." Dorothy stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. "So that's it? I'm fired because I helped someone in need?" "You're fired because you broke company policy," Mr. Reeves interjected. "Clean out your locker and turn in your name tag before you leave." As Dorothy turned to leave, Mr. Lawrence called out, "For what it's worth, Dorothy, I'm sorry it had to end this way." But as she walked out of the office, those words brought her no comfort. All she could think about was how she was going to pay her rent, how she was going to buy groceries, how she was going to survive. As she made her way to the employee locker room, she could feel the stares of her co-workers, could hear the whispers. Word traveled fast in a place like this. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Dorothy Manning had been fired for helping an old man buy his groceries. She cleaned out her locker mechanically, barely seeing the items she shoved into her bag. As she pinned her name tag to the bulletin board, a final act of surrendering her identity in this place, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror on the locker door. The face that looked back at her was pale and drawn, eyes wide, with shock and fear. But as she stared at herself, something else sparked in those hazel eyes, determination. She may have lost her job, but she hadn't lost her integrity. She had done the right thing, and no one could take that away from her. With her head held high, Dorothy walked out of Greenwood Supermarket for the last time. The automatic doors hissed closed behind her, shutting her out of the world she had known for the past 3 years. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. But she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began the long walk home. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Given the chance, she would make the same choice again. Because sometimes doing the right thing came at a price, and Dorothy was willing to pay it. Dorothy's small apartment felt even smaller as she entered, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She dropped her bag by the door and leaned against it, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall. The events of the day replayed in her mind like a stuck record. The gratitude in Franklin's eyes, the harsh words of Mr. Lawrence, the finality of pinning her name tag to the bulletin board. Each memory brought a fresh wave of emotion, a mixture of pride, anger, and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. As the last rays of sunlight faded from her window, Dorothy forced herself to move. She walked to the kitchenette, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Opening the refrigerator, she was met with a stark reminder of her new reality. A half-empty bottle of water, a wrinkled apple, and a loaf of bread that had seen better days. Her stomach growled, a harsh sound in the quiet apartment, but Dorothy ignored it. Instead, she grabbed her laptop and settled on the worn couch, determined to start job hunting immediately. Hours ticked by as Dorothy scoured job boards, filled out applications, and updated her resume. The glow of the screen illuminated her face in the darkened room, casting shadows that deepened the worry lines around her eyes. As the clock on her laptop ticked over to midnight, Dorothy rubbed her tired eyes. She had applied to every entry-level position she could find, cashier jobs, receptionist positions, even janitorial work, anything that might help her keep a roof over her head and food on her table. But as she closed her laptop, a wave of despair washed over her. She knew the reality of the job market. It could take weeks, maybe even months, to find a new position, and her savings wouldn't last nearly that long. Dorothy's gaze fell on a framed photo on her coffee table. It showed a younger version of herself standing between her parents. They were all smiling, their arms around each other, looking like they didn't have a care in the world. The sight of her parents' faces brought a fresh ache to Dorothy's heart. They had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident, leaving Dorothy alone in the world. She had been working at the supermarket then too, and her co-workers had become like a second family to her. Now she had lost that family as well. Dorothy picked up the photo, running her fingers over the smiling faces. "What would you do, Mom?" she whispered. "How would you handle this, Dad?" But the frozen smiles offered no answers, and Dorothy felt more alone than ever. She set the photo down and made her way to the bathroom. As she brushed her teeth, she couldn't help but stare at her reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at her seemed older somehow, the weight of her worries etched into the lines around her eyes and mouth. But there was something else. There too, a glimmer of the same determination she had felt leaving the supermarket. She may be down, but she wasn't out. Not yet. As she crawled into bed, Dorothy's mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if she couldn't find another job? What if she had to move out of her apartment? What if she ended up on the streets just like the homeless people she often saw on her way to work? She tossed and turned, sleep eluding her as her anxieties played out in vivid detail behind her closed eyelids. The digital clock on her bedside table blinked relentlessly, marking the passage of time as Dorothy's worries grew. At 3 a.m. she gave up on sleep altogether. She got up and walked to the window, pushing it open to let in the cool night air. The street below was quiet, the occasional car passing by, its headlights briefly illuminating the darkness before fading away. Dorothy leaned on the windowsill, looking up at the sky. The city lights obscured most of the stars, but she could make out a few twinkling faintly in the distance. She remembered something her father used to say when times were tough. "Keep your chin up, Dottie. There are still stars in the sky even when you can't see them." The memory brought a small smile to her lips. Her dad had always been an optimist, always looking for the silver lining in every cloud. What would he say about her situation now? Probably that she had done the right thing, that kindness was never wasted, that things would work out in the end, and her mum would hug her and tell her how proud she was, how Dorothy's compassion was her greatest strength. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Dorothy made a decision. She wouldn't let this setback define her. She would keep pushing forward, keep looking for opportunities, keep believing that things would get better. She might have lost her job, but she hadn't lost herself, and as long as she held on to that, she had hope. With renewed determination, Dorothy went back to bed. She had a long day ahead of her, and she needed whatever rest she could get. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Franklin's grateful smile. Whatever happened next, she knew she had made a difference in someone's life. And that, she decided, was worth more than any job. The harsh beeping of her alarm clock jolted Dorothy awake. For a moment she lay there, disoriented, the events of the previous day feeling like a distant nightmare. but as consciousness fully returned, so did the reality of her situation. She was unemployed. Dorothy forced herself out of bed, her body protesting after the restless night. The morning sunlight streaming through her window seemed almost mocking in its cheerfulness. She shuffled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to wake up fully. As she stared at her reflection, Dorothy made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let this situation defeat her. She had overcome challenges before, and she would overcome this one too. With renewed determination, she got dressed in her most professional outfit, a simple black skirt and a crisp white blouse. It wasn't much, but it made her feel more put together, more in control. In the kitchen, Dorothy hesitated before the nearly empty refrigerator. She needed to conserve what little food she had, but she also knew she needed energy for the day ahead. In the end, she compromised, cutting a thin slice of bread and spreading it with the last of her peanut butter. As she ate her meager breakfast, Dorothy pulled out her laptop and began to plan her day. She had made a list of local businesses the night before, places where she might be able to drop off her resume in person. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Just as she was about to leave, her phone pinged with a notification. It was an email, response to one of the many job applications she had sent out the night before. Her heart raced as she opened it, hope surging through her veins. But as quickly as it had come, the hope faded. It was a standard rejection email, thanking her for her interest, but informing her that they had decided to pursue other candidates. Dorothy took a deep breath, pushing down the disappointment. It was just one rejection. There would be other opportunities. With her head held high, Dorothy left her apartment, locking the door behind her. The morning air was crisp, carrying the promise of a warm day ahead. As she walked down the street, resume folder clutched tightly in her hand, she couldn't help but notice how different everything looked. The world seemed to be moving on as usual, people hurrying to work, children heading to school, the rhythm of the city pulsing around her. But for Dorothy, everything had changed. She was no longer part of that morning rush, no longer had a place to be, a purpose to fulfill. Her first stop was a small bookstore a few blocks from her apartment. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, the smell of paper and ink enveloping her. An elderly woman looked up from behind the counter, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice kind but curious. Dorothy approached the counter, her resume folder clutched tightly to her chest. "Yes, I was wondering if you might be hiring. I have my resume here if you'd like to take a look." The woman's face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, dear, we're not hiring at the moment. It's just me and my grandson running the place these days." Dorothy nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I understand. Thank you for your time." As she turned to leave, the woman called out, "Wait a moment." She rummaged behind the counter and pulled out a small "Help Wanted" sign. The cafe next door was looking for help. You might try there. Gratitude welled up in Dorothy's chest. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice wavering slightly. The woman smiled. "Good luck, dear. I hope you find something soon." Dorothy left the bookstore with a glimmer of hope. The cafe was bustling when she entered, the aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries filling the air. She approached the counter, where a harried-looking barista was taking orders. "Excuse me," Dorothy said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the noise. "I saw the Help Wanted sign. Who should I speak to about applying?" The barista barely glanced at her. "The manager's not in today. You can leave your resume and we'll call you if we're interested." Dorothy's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "Of course, thank you." She pulled her resume from the folder and handed it over, watching as the barista carelessly tossed it onto a pile of papers behind the counter. As she left the cafe, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that her resume would never be seen, lost among the clutter behind the counter. But she pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on negativity. The rest of the morning followed, a similar pattern. Dorothy went from shop to shop, business to business, her hope dwindling with each interaction. Some places were polite but uninterested. Others didn't even bother to look at her resume. By lunchtime, she had covered most of the businesses in her neighborhood without any success. Exhausted and disheartened, Dorothy found herself in the small park near her apartment. She sat heavily on a bench, her feet aching from walking all morning. The sun was high in the sky now, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill settling in her heart. She watched as people strolled through the park, some walking dogs, others pushing strollers or jogging. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a direction. Dorothy felt adrift, unsure of where to go or what to do next. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to Franklin, the elderly man she had helped at the supermarket. She wondered how he was doing, if he had enough food now. Despite everything that had happened, she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. The memory of his grateful smile was a small comfort in the face of her current struggles. A group of pigeons landed near her feet, cooing and pecking at the ground. Dorothy reached into her bag and pulled out the remains of her meager breakfast. She crumbled the bread, tossing small pieces to the birds. As she watched them eat, she was struck by a thought. Even in her current situation, she still had something to give. The realization brought tears to her eyes, but also a renewed sense of determination. She might be struggling, but she wasn't beaten. Not yet. With a deep breath, Dorothy stood up. She still had a few more places on her list to visit. And after that, she would go home and send out more online applications. She would keep pushing forward, keep trying, because that's who she was. That's who her parents had raised her to be. As she left the park, Dorothy's steps were a little lighter, her chin a little higher. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she would face it head-on, with the same compassion and determination that had led her to help Franklin in the first place. Little did she know that across town, events were unfolding that would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. As Dorothy continued her job search, her act of kindness at the supermarket was having ripple effects she couldn't have anticipated. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, Franklin Holloway sat in his study, lost in thought. Despite his wealth and success, Franklin had always felt a disconnect from the world around him. Years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations had left him cynical, wondering if there was any genuine kindness left in the world. It was this doubt that had led him to his experiment at the supermarket, disguising himself as a struggling elderly man to see how people would react. What he hadn't expected was Dorothy. Her selfless act had touched something deep within him, rekindling a spark of hope he thought had long since extinguished. As he gazed out at the city below, Franklin couldn't shake the image of the young woman's compassionate smile, the warmth in her eyes as she helped him without hesitation. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice gruff from disuse. His personal assistant, Michael, entered the room. At 35, Michael was the picture of efficiency, his suit immaculate and his tablet ever present in his hand. "Mr. Holloway," Michael said, his tone respectful but tinged with concern, "I've gathered the information you requested about the young woman from the supermarket." Franklin turned from the window, his interest piqued. "And?" Michael consulted his tablet. "Her name is Dorothy Manning, 24 years old. She's been working at Greenwood Supermarket for the past 3 years. However—" He paused, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Franklin pressed. "She was fired yesterday, sir. Apparently for violating company policy by paying for a customer's groceries." Franklin's hands clenched into fists, anger flaring in his chest. "Fired? For helping someone in need?" Michael nodded, his expression grave. "It seems so, sir. From what I've gathered, she's now unemployed and likely struggling financially." Franklin stood, pacing the room as he processed this information. The injustice of it all ignited a fire within him. Here was a young woman who had shown extraordinary kindness, and instead of being rewarded, she had been punished. "This won't do," Franklin muttered, more to himself than to Michael. "This won't do at all." He turned to his assistant, determination etched into every line of his face. "Michael, I want you to arrange a meeting with the owner of Greenwood Supermarket, today, if possible." Michael's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course, sir. May I ask what this is about?" Franklin's eyes gleamed with a mix of anger and purpose. "It's about righting a wrong, Michael, and perhaps it's about more than that." As Michael left to make the arrangements, Franklin returned to the window. The city sprawled before him, a maze of buildings and streets, each hiding countless stories of struggle and triumph. Somewhere out there was Dorothy, unaware that her simple act of kindness was about to set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others. Franklin felt a sense of anticipation building within him. For years, he had been searching for a way to make a real difference in the world, to leave a legacy beyond just accumulating wealth. Maybe, just maybe, Dorothy's compassion had shown him the way. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Franklin made a silent promise. He would help Dorothy, yes, but he would do more than that. He would use his resources, his influence, to create a ripple effect of kindness that would spread far beyond one supermarket or one young woman. The game was afoot, and Franklin Holloway was ready to play. While Franklin set his plans in motion, Dorothy's day had gone from bad to worse. After hours of fruitless job hunting, she returned to her apartment, her feet aching and her spirit deflated. As she unlocked her door, she noticed an envelope taped to it. Her heart sank as she recognized the logo of her apartment complex. Inside, she found a notice reminding her that rent was due in a week. The words blurred before her eyes as the reality of her situation hit her anew. She had some savings, but not enough to cover rent for more than a month or two. After that, Dorothy pushed the thought away, unable to face the possibility of losing her home on top of everything else. She entered her apartment, the silence enveloping her like a heavy blanket. The blinking light on her answering machine caught her eye, and she pressed play, hoping against hope for good news. The first message was from her best friend, Lisa. "Hey Dot, I heard what happened at work. That's so messed up. Call me if you need anything, okay? I mean it." Dorothy smiled weakly, grateful for her friend's support. The next message, however, wiped the smile from her face. "This is Sandra from Westside Mart returning your call about the cashier position. I'm sorry, but we've already filled that role. We'll keep your resume on file. Good luck with your job search." The beep signaling the end of the messages seemed to echo in the quiet apartment. Dorothy sank onto her couch, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had always prided herself on her independence, on being able to take care of herself. Now, for the first time since losing her parents, she felt truly alone and overwhelmed. As the evening wore on, Dorothy forced herself to eat a small dinner of canned soup, trying to make her dwindling food supplies last. She then spent hours on her laptop, scouring job boards and sending out application after application. But with each submission, the knot of anxiety in her stomach grew tighter. What if she couldn't find a job in time? What if she had to leave her apartment? The thoughts chased each other in circles in her mind, keeping sleep at bay long into the night. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a chaotic mix of endless job applications and the disappointed faces of her parents. She tossed and turned, her subconscious mind grappling with fears her waking self couldn't fully face. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through her curtains, Dorothy woke with a start. For a moment, she lay still, the remnants of her troubled dreams clinging to her like cobwebs. Then, with a deep breath, she pushed herself out of bed. She couldn't afford to wallow in fear or self-pity. She had to keep moving forward, had to believe that something would work out. It had to. As she went through her morning routine, Dorothy tried to bolster her spirits. "You can do this," she told her reflection as she brushed her teeth. "One step at a time, that's all you can do." She was just about to leave for another day of job hunting when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and Dorothy's heart leapt with hope. Could it be a potential employer? "Hello," she answered, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Is this Dorothy Manning?" a deep, professional voice asked. "Yes, this is she." "Ms. Manning, my name is Michael Reeves. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Franklin Holloway. He would like to meet with you this afternoon, if you're available." Dorothy's mind raced. Franklin Holloway. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. And why would he want to meet with her? "I'm sorry," she said, confusion evident in her voice. "What is this regarding?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Holloway would prefer to discuss that in person. I can assure you, Ms. Manning, this is a matter of great importance. A car can be sent to pick you up at 2 p.m. if that's convenient for you. Dorothy hesitated. Every instinct told her to be cautious, but she couldn't deny the flutter of hope in her chest. Whatever this was, it had to be better than another day of fruitless job searching. All right, she said finally. 2 p.m. works for me. Excellent, Michael replied. The car will be there at 2 p.m. sharp. Good day, Miss Manning. As Dorothy hung up the phone, she felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Who was Franklin Holloway, and what could he possibly want with her? For better or worse, it seemed the winds of change were blowing in her direction. Little did she know just how strong those winds would prove to be. At precisely 2 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of Dorothy's apartment building. She had spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, alternating between excitement and anxiety about the mysterious meeting ahead. As she approached the car, the driver stepped out and opened the rear door for her. Miss Manning? He inquired politely. Dorothy nodded, suddenly feeling underdressed in her simple blouse and skirt. She slid into the plush leather seat, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The car glided smoothly through the city streets, heading towards the affluent downtown area. Dorothy watched as familiar neighborhoods gave way to towering skyscrapers and high-end boutiques. She had rarely ventured into this part of the city, and she couldn't help but feel out of place. Finally, the car pulled up in front of an imposing glass and steel building that seemed to touch the sky. The driver opened her door, and Dorothy stepped out, craning her neck to see the top of the structure. Mr. Holloway's office is on the top floor, the driver informed her. They're expecting you. Dorothy entered the building, her footsteps echoing in the vast marble-floored lobby. A security guard directed her to a private elevator, which whisked her up to the penthouse level in a matter of seconds. As the elevator doors opened, Dorothy found herself in a reception area that was larger than her entire apartment. A well-dressed woman sat behind a desk, her fingers flying over a keyboard. "Ms. Manning?" the receptionist asked, looking up. At Dorothy's nod, she smiled. "Mr. Holloway will see you now. Please, go right in." Dorothy approached the large double doors, her palms sweating. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and knocked. "Come in," a deep voice called from within. She pushed open the door and stepped into a spacious office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, but Dorothy's attention was immediately drawn to the man rising from behind. A massive desk. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore an expensive suit that screamed of wealth and power, but there was something familiar about him, something Dorothy couldn't quite place. "Ms. Manning," the man said, his voice warm. "Thank you for coming. I'm Franklin Holloway." And suddenly it clicked. The eyes, the voice. This was the elderly man from the supermarket. Dorothy's mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the frail old man she had helped with the powerful figure before her. You're him," she stammered, "from the supermarket." Franklin smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Indeed I am. Please have a seat. We have much to discuss." Still in shock, Dorothy sank into one of the plush chairs in front of his desk. Franklin sat as well, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "First," he said, his tone serious, "I want to apologize for the deception. I often disguise myself to move about the city unrecognized. It allows me to observe, shall we say." Dorothy nodded slowly, still trying to process the situation. "What you did that day, Ms. Manning," Franklin continued, "was extraordinary. In a world where people so often look the other way, you chose to help a stranger in need, and it cost you dearly." Dorothy's eyes widened. "You know about that?" Franklin nodded gravely. "I do. And I want you to know that I'm deeply sorry for the trouble I've caused you. But I'm also incredibly grateful. Your act of kindness, well, it's changed things for me. Changed my perspective on a great many things." He stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. "I've spent my life building a business empire, Ms. Manning. I've accumulated more wealth than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But lately I've been wondering what it's all for. What legacy am I leaving behind? He turned back to face her, his eyes intense. And then you came along. Your simple act of compassion showed me what truly matters. It made me realize what I want my legacy to be. Dorothy sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. Franklin returned to his desk and pressed a button on his intercom. "Michael, could you join us, please?" Moments later, the door opened, and a man entered carrying a folder. Dorothy recognized his voice as the one from the phone call. "Ms. Manning?" Franklin said, "I have a proposition for you. One that I hope will not only solve your current difficulties, but also help me set a new course for my company and perhaps for this city." He nodded to Michael, who handed the folder to Dorothy. With trembling hands, she opened it, her eyes widening as she saw what was inside. "This," Franklin explained, "is a job offer. But it's more than that. It's an opportunity to be part of something bigger." Dorothy scanned the document, her heart racing. The position described was for a community outreach coordinator at Holloway Enterprises, with a salary that made her jaw drop. I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at Franklin. "Why me? I don't have any experience in corporate outreach." Franklin's eyes twinkled. "But you have something far more valuable, Ms. Manning. You have genuine compassion and a willingness to act on it. That's exactly what I need." He leaned forward, his voice passionate. "I want to create a division within my company dedicated to community support and social responsibility. Not just writing checks for charity, but actively working to improve lives in this city. And I want you to help lead it." Dorothy's mind whirled with the possibilities. It seemed too good to be true, like something out of a fairy tale. But what would I actually do?" Franklin smiled. "You'd work with local organizations to identify needs in the community. You'd develop programs to address those needs, food banks, job training, affordable housing initiatives. You'd be my eyes and ears on the ground, helping to ensure that our resources are used where they can do the most good." He paused, his expression growing serious. "It won't be easy, Ms. Manning. You'll face challenges and skepticism. But I believe you have the heart and the strength for this task. What do you say?" Dorothy looked down at the contract again, then back up at Franklin. She thought about her struggles of the past few days, about the people she had encountered. During her job search, people who, like her, were just trying to make ends meet. She thought about Franklin in the supermarket, and how a small act of kindness had led to this moment. Taking a deep breath, she met Franklin's gaze. "Mr. Holloway, I accept." Franklin's face broke into a wide smile. "Excellent. Welcome. Aboard, Ms. Manning." He stood and extended his hand, which Dorothy shook, still somewhat dazed. As Michael began explaining the details of her new position and the next steps, Dorothy felt a surge of emotions, relief, excitement, and a touch of fear at the enormity of the task ahead. But underlying it all was a sense of purpose, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Little did she know that this was just the beginning. The decision she had just made would not only change her life, but would set in motion a series of events that would touch countless lives across the city. The ripple effect of her simple act of kindness was about to become a tidal wave of change. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Dorothy. She moved from her small apartment to a more spacious one provided by Holloway Enterprises, closer to the office. The new space felt almost too big, too luxurious, but Franklin had insisted it was necessary for her new position. Her first day at work was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The Holloway Enterprises building was a hive of activity, with people in suits rushing about with purposeful strides. Dorothy felt out of place in her new business attire, constantly adjusting her blazer and smoothing down her skirt. Michael, Franklin's assistant, had taken her under his wing, showing her around the office and introducing her to key personnel. "Don't worry," he'd said with a kind smile, noticing her nervousness. "Everyone here started somewhere. You'll find your footing soon enough." As the days passed, Dorothy threw herself into her new role with characteristic determination. She spent hours researching local charities and community organizations, setting up meetings, and drafting proposals for new initiatives. It was challenging work, far removed from her days at the supermarket checkout, but she found it deeply fulfilling. One afternoon, about a month into her new job, Franklin called her into his office. "How are you settling in, Dorothy?" he asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. It's incredible, Mr. Holloway," she replied honestly. "I never imagined I'd be doing work like this. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real." Franklin chuckled. "I'm glad to hear it. And please, call me Franklin. We're going to be working closely together after all." He leaned back in his chair, his expression turning serious. "I've been looking over your proposals, Dorothy. They're good. Very good, in fact. You have a real talent for identifying needs and coming up with practical solutions." Dorothy felt a flush of pride at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Franklin. I'm just trying to think about what would have helped me, or people like me, when times were tough." Franklin nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the perspective we need. Now I have a challenge for you. I want you to think bigger." "Bigger?" Dorothy echoed, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Yes, bigger," Franklin confirmed. "Your ideas for food banks and job training, programs are excellent starts, but I want you to dream, Dorothy. If resources were no object, what would you do to really make a difference in this city?" Dorothy's mind raced with possibilities. She thought about the struggles she had faced, about the people she had met during her brief period of unemployment. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. "Well," she began hesitantly, "one of the biggest problems I saw was housing. So many people are just one paycheck away from homelessness. What if we could create a safety net? Not just shelters, but actual homes for people who are struggling?" Franklin leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "Go on." Encouraged, Dorothy continued, her words coming faster as her excitement grew. "We could buy up some of the abandoned buildings in the poorer neighborhoods, renovate them, create affordable housing units, but more than that, community centers, job training facilities, daycare for working parents, a whole support system to help people get back on their feet." She paused, suddenly aware of how carried away she had gotten. "I'm sorry, that's probably too much. I know it would be incredibly expensive and complicated." But Franklin was smiling broadly. "No, Dorothy, that's exactly the kind of thinking I was hoping for. It is ambitious, yes, and it will be challenging to implement. But that's precisely the kind of impact I want us to have." He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "You know, when I started this company, all I cared about was making money. But now, at this stage of my life, I've realized that true wealth isn't about how much you have, but how much you can give." He turned back to Dorothy, his expression determined. "I want to leave a legacy, Dorothy, not of buildings or bank accounts, but of lives changed for the better. And I believe your idea could be the cornerstone of that legacy." Dorothy felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. But where do we even start with something like this?" Franklin's eyes twinkled. "We start by putting together a team, experts in urban planning, social work, education, and you, Dorothy, will be at the heart of it all. Your compassion, your first-hand understanding of the struggles people face. That's what will keep us grounded, ensure that we're truly meeting people's needs." As the reality of what Franklin was proposing sank in, Dorothy felt a surge of determination. This was so much bigger than anything she had ever dreamed of doing. It was daunting, yes, but also incredibly exciting. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." Franklin beamed at her. "That's what I like to hear. Now let's get to work. We have a city to change." As Dorothy left Franklin's office that day, her mind was buzzing with ideas and possibilities. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But she also knew that this was her chance to make a real difference, to help people in ways she had only dreamed of before. The girl who had once struggled to make ends meet as a supermarket cashier was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to take on the world, armed with compassion, determination, and the resources to turn her dreams into reality. Little did Dorothy know that her journey was about to take another unexpected turn, one that would test her resolve and push her to her limits. But for now, she walked with a spring in her step, eager to begin this new chapter in her life. The seeds of change had been planted. Now it was time to watch them grow. As weeks turned into months, Dorothy found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The project she had proposed to Franklin, now dubbed New Horizons, had grown far beyond her initial vision. What had started as an idea for affordable housing had blossomed into a comprehensive urban renewal initiative that was set to transform some of the city's most neglected neighborhoods. Dorothy's days were filled with meetings, with architects, urban planners, social workers, and community leaders. She pored over blueprints, budget reports, and impact assessments. It was challenging work, far beyond anything she had ever done before, but she attacked each task with determination and enthusiasm. However, as the project gained momentum, Dorothy began to face new challenges. Not everyone was as enthusiastic about New Horizons as she and Franklin were. One crisp autumn morning, Dorothy arrived at the office to find Franklin waiting for her, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, ushering her into his office. Once inside, he handed her a newspaper. The headline made her heart sink. "Holloway's New Horizons, gentrification in disguise." "It seems we've ruffled some feathers," Franklin said, his voice tired. "There's concern in some quarters that our project will end up pushing out the very people we're trying to help." Dorothy scanned the article, her dismay growing with each paragraph. The piece quoted local activists and longtime residents who feared that the New Horizons project would lead to increased property values and rents, forcing out low-income families who had lived in these neighborhoods for generations. "But that's not what we're trying to do at all," Dorothy protested, looking up from the paper. "We're creating affordable housing, not luxury condos. How can they think this is gentrification?" Franklin sighed, rubbing his temples. "Perception, Dorothy. In business and in life, perception is often as important as reality. We need to address these concerns head-on." He fixed her with a steady gaze. "I think it's time for you to step into the spotlight, Dorothy. You're the heart of this project. You understand better than anyone the needs of the people we're trying to help. I want you to be the face of New Horizons." Dorothy felt a flutter of panic in her chest. "Me? But I don't know how to handle the media or public speaking. Surely there's someone more qualified." Franklin shook his head. "No one is more qualified than you. Your sincerity, your passion, that's what people need to see. It won't be easy, I won't lie to you. But I believe in you, Dorothy. You can do this." Over the next few weeks, Dorothy found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined. She gave interviews to local newspapers and radio stations. She attended community meetings, sometimes facing hostile crowds who saw her as a corporate stooge rather than someone who genuinely wanted to help. There were nights when she returned to her apartment, exhausted and disheartened. Doubts crept in during the quiet hours. Was she really the right person for this job? Was she in over her head? But then she would remember the people she had met. During her research, the single mother working 3 jobs to keep a roof over her children's heads, the elderly couple forced to choose between paying for medication or food, the young man who had dropped out of college to care for his sick father. These were the people New Horizons was meant to help. She couldn't let them down. One evening, after a particularly grueling community meeting where she had faced a barrage of skeptical questions and outright hostility, Dorothy found herself walking through one of the neighborhoods that New Horizons was set to transform. The streets were lined with boarded-up buildings and overgrown lots. A group of children played in a barren patch of dirt that passed for a park. As she watched them, a voice spoke up beside her. "You're her, aren't you? The Holloway girl?" Dorothy turned to see an elderly woman watching her with sharp eyes. "Yes, I work for Mr. Holloway," she admitted. The woman nodded slowly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 60 years, she said. Seen a lot of promises come and go, a lot of big talk about change and progress, but nothing ever seems to get better for folks like us." Dorothy felt a lump form in her throat. "I understand your skepticism," she said softly. "But I promise you we're not here to push anyone out. We want to make things better, to give people opportunities they've never had before." The old woman regarded her for a long moment. "You really believe that, don't you?" she said finally. "With all my heart," Dorothy replied. To her surprise, the woman smiled. "Well, maybe there's hope yet. Just remember, young lady, this isn't about buildings or programs. It's about people. Our lives, our homes, our community, don't you forget that. As Dorothy walked away, the woman's words echoed in her mind. She realized that in all the meetings and planning sessions, in all the debates over budgets and zoning, regulations, she had started to lose sight of what really mattered. That night she sat down at her computer and began to write. She poured out her heart, explaining her own background, her struggles, and her vision for new horizons. She wrote about the people she had met, the stories she had heard, and the change she believed was possible. When she finished, she had a speech, not a polished corporate presentation, but a raw, honest appeal from one person who had known hardship to others who were still facing it. The next day, she asked Franklin to call a press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters and cameras, her heart pounding but her voice steady, Dorothy delivered her speech. She spoke of hope and opportunity, of community and compassion. She addressed the fears and concerns head-on, promising transparency and community involvement every step of the way. And she issued a challenge, not just to the residents of the affected neighborhoods, but to the entire city, to come together and create real, lasting change. As she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. Dorothy saw Franklin beaming at her from the side of the stage, pride shining in his eyes. In the days that followed, the tide of public opinion began to shift. There were still skeptics and critics, of course, but more and more people were starting to believe in the vision of New Horizons. Dorothy knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, more moments of doubt. But as she looked at the growing team of people committed to making New Horizons a reality, as she read the messages of support and encouragement that began to flood in, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had found her voice and she was ready to use it. The girl who had once been fired for an act of kindness was now poised to transform an entire city. And this was only the beginning. As the New Horizons project moved from planning to implementation, Dorothy found herself facing a new set of challenges. The press conference had been a turning point, generating positive buzz and bringing more supporters on board. But now came the hard part, turning plans and promises into concrete action. The first neighborhood selected for the New Horizons makeover was Riverside, a once thriving area that had fallen on hard times. As Dorothy walked through its streets, she could see both the decay of the present and glimmers of its former vitality. Boarded-up storefronts stood next to small businesses stubbornly hanging on. Children played in the shadow of abandoned buildings, their laughter a defiant counterpoint to the neighborhood's visible struggles. Dorothy had insisted on being hands-on with every aspect of the project, and today she was meeting with the construction team to go over the plans for renovating an old warehouse into a community center. As she approached the site, she saw a group of people gathered near the entrance, holding signs. Her heart sank as she read the messages. No to gentrification. Protect our community. Holloway, go home. Taking a deep breath, Dorothy straightened her shoulders and walked towards the group. A burly man with graying hair stepped forward, his expression confrontational. "You must be the Holloway spokesperson," he said, his voice gruff. "Come to tell us how you're going to save our neighborhood." Dorothy met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I'm here to listen. My name is Dorothy Manning, and I'd like to hear your concerns." The man seemed taken aback by her directness. "I'm Joe Ramirez," he said after a moment. "I've lived in Riverside all my life. My parents lived here. My grandparents lived here. And now you people come in, thinking you can just change everything overnight." Dorothy nodded, acknowledging his words. "Mr. Ramirez, I understand your fears. Change can be scary, especially when it comes to your home. But I promise you we're not here to push anyone out. We want to work with the community, not against it." Joe scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Pretty words, but we've heard promises before. What makes you any different?" Dorothy considered her response carefully. "What makes us different is that we're not just here to build buildings. We're here to build partnerships. I'd like to invite you and anyone else who's interested to be part of our community advisory board. You know this neighborhood better than anyone. We need your input, your ideas to make sure we're doing this right." There was a murmur among the protesters. Joe looked surprised, then suspicious. And what power would this advisory board have? Or would it just be for show? Real power, Dorothy assured him. Veto power over any decisions that the community feels go against its interests. Mr. Holloway and I are committed to this being a collaborative effort. Joe studied her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, Ms. Manning, we'll give your advisory board a shot, but we'll be watching closely. As the crowd dispersed, Dorothy felt a mix of relief and trepidation. She had averted a crisis for now, but she knew this was just the beginning. Building trust would be a long, challenging process. Over the next few months, Dorothy threw herself into the work with renewed vigor. The Community Advisory Board became a central part of the New Horizons project, with heated debates and passionate discussions shaping every decision. There were setbacks, of course. Construction delays, budget overruns, and moments of friction between longtime residents and the New Horizons team. But there were triumphs, too. The day the community center opened its doors was a moment Dorothy would never forget. The old warehouse had been transformed into a vibrant space with a job training center, daycare facilities, and a health clinic. The pride on the faces of the local residents who had been involved in its planning and construction was palpable. As she watched children playing in the new playground and elderly residents chatting in the community garden, Dorothy felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had experienced before. This was real, tangible change. But amid the celebrations, Dorothy couldn't shake a nagging worry. The success in Riverside was just the first step. There were other neighborhoods waiting, other communities in need. And not everyone was as open to change as Joe Ramirez had ultimately been. One evening, as she was leaving the community center after a late meeting, Dorothy received a call from Franklin. "Dorothy," his voice was tight with concern, "I need you to come to the office right away. We have a situation." When she arrived, she found Franklin pacing in his office, looking more agitated than she had ever seen him. "What's wrong?" she asked, her concern growing. Franklin handed her a tablet. On the screen was an article from an online news site, the headline blaring, "Holloway's New Horizons, a front for massive land grab." The article alleged that Holloway Enterprises was using the New Horizons project as a cover to acquire vast swathes of real estate at low prices, with plans to develop luxury properties once the neighborhoods had been cleaned up. "This is absurd," Dorothy sputtered, her shock turning to anger as she read. "We've been completely transparent about our plans. Where is this coming from?" Franklin sighed heavily. "It seems our success in Riverside has rattled some powerful people, property developers who had their own plans for these neighborhoods. They're spreading these rumors, trying to turn public opinion against us." Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on winning over the communities they were trying to help, she hadn't considered that there might be opposition from other quarters. "What do we do?" she asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Franklin's expression was grim but determined. "We fight back. With the truth, with transparency, and with results." "But Dorothy," he paused, fixing her with a serious look, "this is going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that?" Dorothy thought about how far she had come, about the people in Riverside whose lives were already changing for the better, about all the other communities waiting for their chance. She thought about her own journey, from a struggling cashier to someone who could make a real difference in the world. She met Franklin's gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we're going to see this through." As she left Franklin's office that night, Dorothy knew that the real battle was just beginning. The New Horizons project was no longer just about rebuilding neighborhoods. It had become a fight for the soul of the city itself. But as daunting as the challenge seemed, Dorothy felt a fire burning within her. She had found her purpose, her calling, and she was not about to back down now. The weeks following the publication of the damaging article were some of the most challenging of Dorothy's life. The allegations of a secret land grab spread like wildfire, fanned by sensationalist media coverage and social media outrage. Overnight, the goodwill they had built up seemed to evaporate. Dorothy found herself besieged on all sides. Reporters hounded her for comments. Protesters picketed the Holloway Enterprises offices, and even some of their staunchest supporters began to waver. The Community Advisory Board in Riverside called an emergency meeting. As Dorothy entered the Community Center, she could feel the tension in the air. Joe Ramirez, who had become one of their strongest allies, looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Is it true?" he demanded as soon as she sat down. "Are we just pawns in some big real estate scheme?" Dorothy took a deep breath, fighting to keep her composure. "No, Joe, absolutely not. These allegations are completely false. Our intentions are exactly what we've always said they were, to help rebuild and revitalize these neighborhoods for the people who live here." "Then why haven't you sued for libel?" another board member asked. "If it's not true, why not take legal action?" "We're considering all our options," Dorothy replied carefully. "But right now, our focus is on continuing the work we've started. We believe the best way to counter these lies is with the truth of our actions." The meeting went on for hours, with Dorothy patiently addressing each concern, reiterating their commitment to transparency and community involvement. By the end, she had managed to calm some fears, but she could see that doubt had taken root. As she left the meeting, exhausted and disheartened, Dorothy's phone buzzed with a message from Franklin. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Bring your fighting spirit." The next morning, Dorothy arrived at the Holloway Enterprises offices to find the conference room already full. Franklin sat at the head of the table, his face etched with lines of worry. Around him were the company's top executives, legal team, and PR consultants. "Thank you all for coming," Franklin began as Dorothy took her seat. "As you know, we're facing a serious crisis. These allegations are threatening everything we've worked for with New Horizons." He turned to the head of the legal team. "What are our options?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "We could pursue legal action against the publication that ran the original story. However, that could be a long, drawn-out process, and it might make us look like we're trying to silence criticism." The PR consultant jumped in. "From a public relations standpoint, we need to go on the offensive. Get ahead of this story. I suggest a series of press conferences, interviews, maybe even a televised town hall meeting." As the discussion continued, Dorothy found her frustration growing. They were talking about strategies and optics, but something felt off. Finally, she couldn't stay silent any longer. "This isn't right," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. All eyes turned to her. "What do you mean, Dorothy?" Franklin asked, his brow furrowed. Dorothy stood up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We're approaching this all wrong. We're acting like a corporation trying to protect its interests. But that's not what New Horizons is about. We're supposed to be about people, about communities." She looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "Instead of hiding behind lawyers and PR strategies, why don't we open our doors? Invite everyone, the media, the critics, the skeptics, to come and see for themselves what we're doing. Let them talk to the people in Riverside, see the changes happening there." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Franklin started to smile. "Dorothy's right," he said, his voice filled with newfound energy. "We've nothing to hide. Let's show the world what New Horizons is really about." Over the next few days, Dorothy's idea was put into action. They organized an open house in Riverside, inviting media outlets, community leaders from other neighborhoods, and even the authors of the critical articles. The day of the event dawned bright and clear. Dorothy stood at the entrance of the community center, greeting visitors and answering questions. She watched with pride as Riverside residents led tours, showing off the new facilities and sharing their own stories of how the project had impacted their lives. Joe Ramirez was there, his initial skepticism now replaced by fierce pride in his community. "This," he told a group of reporters, gesturing at the bustling community center, "this is the real New Horizons, not some corporate land grab, but people coming together to make things better." As the day wore on, Dorothy could sense the tide of opinion turning. The skepticism of the visitors gave way to interest, then to cautious optimism. Even some of the harshest critics seemed impressed by what they saw. By the end of the day, Dorothy was exhausted but exhilarated. As the last of the visitors left, Franklin approached her, a broad smile on his face. "You did it, Dorothy," he said, squeezing her shoulder. "You turned this around. I don't think I've ever been more proud." Dorothy felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. But even as she basked in the success of the day, she knew that their fight was far from over. They had won a battle, but the war for the future of the city was just beginning. As she looked out over Riverside, at the mix of old and new, at the people who had put their trust in New Horizons, Dorothy felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Because now she knew, beyond any doubt, that what they were doing was right. And that was worth fighting for. The open house in Riverside had been a turning point, but Dorothy knew better than to think their troubles were over. While public opinion had shifted back in their favor, the forces opposing New Horizons hadn't given up. If anything, seeing the project's success had made them more determined to stop it. As New Horizons prepared to expand into its second neighborhood, an area known as Oakwood, the resistance grew more organized and more vocal. Property developers and local politicians who had long profited from the status quo began to push back hard, using their influence to create roadblocks at every turn. Zoning meetings became battlegrounds, with New Horizons representatives facing off against lawyers and lobbyists. Permit applications that should have been routine were delayed or denied, and through it all, a steady stream of negative press continued, questioning every move the project made. Dorothy found herself working around the clock, juggling meetings with city officials, community outreach events, and strategy sessions with the New Horizons team. The stress was taking its toll. She'd lost weight, dark circles had taken up permanent residence under her eyes, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had a full night's sleep. One particularly grueling day, after a heated city council meeting where the expansion into Oakwood had once again been delayed, Dorothy retreated to her office, feeling the weight of their challenges pressing down on her. As she slumped in her chair, there was a knock at the door. She looked up to see Franklin entering, his face etched with concern. "Rough day?" he asked gently, taking a seat across from her. Dorothy nodded, too tired to even attempt a smile. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a losing battle," she admitted, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "For every step forward we take, it feels like we're being pushed 2 steps back." Franklin was quiet for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Dorothy, do you know why I chose you for this project?" She shook her head, caught off guard by the question. "Because you have something that no amount of money can buy, no university can teach. You have heart. You truly care about the people we're trying to help, and that, more than anything else, is what's going to see us through this." His words sparked something in Dorothy, reigniting the passion that had been flickering under the weight of their challenges. She sat up straighter, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We can't give up. There's too much at stake." Franklin smiled, the pride evident in his eyes. "That's the spirit. Now, I think it's time we changed our strategy. We've been playing defense for too long. It's time to go on the offensive." Over the next few hours, they hatched a plan. Instead of simply reacting to the opposition's moves, they would take control of the narrative. They would launch a city-wide campaign to showcase the success of New Horizons in Riverside and paint a vivid picture of what could be achieved in Oakwood and beyond. The campaign kicked off with a series of town hall meetings across the city. Dorothy, along with residents from Riverside, traveled from neighborhood to neighborhood, sharing their stories and their vision for the future. In community centers, church basements, and school auditoriums, Dorothy spoke from the heart. She talked about her own journey, about the transformative power of compassion and community, and she issued a challenge to the city to imagine what could be achieved if they all worked together for positive change. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life were drawn to the sincerity and passion of the New Horizons message. Volunteers began to flock to the project, offering their time and skills. Local businesses stepped up with donations and support. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A group of students from the City University's urban planning department approached New Horizons with an idea. They had been studying the project and had developed a proposal for how the New Horizons model could be scaled up to transform not just individual neighborhoods, but entire districts of the city. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and soon a coalition began to form. Community leaders from neighborhoods across the city, inspired by what they had seen in Riverside, began to clamor for New Horizons to come to their areas. As the momentum built, even some of their former opponents began to change their tune. Politicians who had once blocked their efforts now sought photo opportunities with Dorothy and Franklin. Developers who had tried to undermine the project now approached with offers of partnership. The tide was turning and everyone could feel it. The New Horizons vision was no longer just a project, it was becoming a movement. But even as victory seemed within reach, Dorothy knew that this was the most dangerous moment. Success had a way of breeding complacency, and they couldn't afford to let down their guard. As she stood on the stage at their largest town hall meeting yet, looking out over a sea of eager faces, Dorothy felt the weight of their hopes and dreams on her shoulders. This was the moment of truth, the crucible in which the future of New Horizons and the city itself would be decided. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice ringing out clear and strong, "we stand at a crossroads." "I'm so proud of you, Dorothy," Franklin said softly. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when I first offered you this job. You've become the heart of this project, its driving force." Dorothy felt a lump form in her throat. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Franklin. You gave me the opportunity of a lifetime." Franklin shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "I may have opened the door, but you're the one who walked through it. You're the one who inspired people, who kept pushing forward even when things seemed impossible." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Which is why I've made a decision. I'm stepping down as CEO of Holloway Enterprises," Dorothy gasped. "What? But why?" "Because it's time," Franklin replied. "Time for new blood, new ideas. And there's only one person I trust to take this company and New Horizons into the future." It took a moment for his words to sink in. When they did, Dorothy felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. "Me," she whispered. "But I don't have the experience." Franklin laid a hand on her shoulder. "You have something far more valuable than traditional experience, Dorothy. You have vision, compassion, and the ability to inspire others. You've already been leading this company in all but name. It's time to make it official." As the reality of Franklin's offer began to settle in, Dorothy felt a mix of fear and excitement. This was so much bigger than anything she had ever imagined for herself. But as she looked out over the city, at the tangible results of their work, she knew she couldn't walk away from this opportunity. "Okay," she said finally, her voice firm. "I'll do it. For New Horizons, for this city, for all the people we've helped and all those we still can help." Franklin beamed at her. "I knew you'd say yes. Now let's go back to the party. We have a lot to celebrate, and even more to look forward to." As they made their way back downstairs, Dorothy's mind was already racing with ideas for the future. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness at a supermarket checkout had led her here, to the threshold of a new and exciting chapter, and she was ready to embrace it with open arms. Chapter 14. Full Circle. 5 years had passed. Since Dorothy Manning had become CEO of Holloway Enterprises and the driving force behind the New Horizons initiative. In that time, the project had expanded beyond their wildest dreams, transforming not just individual neighborhoods, but entire sections of the city. The model they had pioneered in Riverside and Oakwood had been refined and replicated across the urban landscape. Abandoned factories had been converted into mixed-use spaces, combining affordable housing, job training centers, and small business incubators. Parks and community gardens had sprung up in once derelict lots. Schools had been revitalized, healthcare clinics established, and a network of support services put in place to help residents thrive. But perhaps the most significant change was in the spirit of the city itself. The success of New Horizons had sparked a renewed sense of civic pride and community engagement. People who had once felt powerless to change their circumstances were now actively involved in shaping the future of their neighborhoods. On a warm spring morning, Dorothy stood in front of a familiar building, the Greenwood supermarket where her journey had begun. The store had seen better days, its paint peeling and its signs faded, but that was about to change. As a crowd gathered, Dorothy stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this special day. Today, we're not just reopening a supermarket. We're coming full circle, returning to the place where New Horizons began." She gestured to the building behind her. "This supermarket will be more than just a place to buy groceries. It will be a community hub, offering job training, nutrition, classes, and a food bank for those in need. It will be a place where acts of kindness are not just allowed, but encouraged." As she spoke, Dorothy caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Joe Ramirez, now a respected community leader and a key member of the New Horizons Advisory Board, gave her a thumbs up. "But we're not stopping here," Dorothy continued. "Today I'm excited to announce the next phase of New Horizons. We're taking our model nationwide, partnering with cities across the country to implement similar programs. We've proven that change is possible, that communities can be transformed. Now it's time to spread that message far and wide." The applause was enthusiastic, but Dorothy wasn't finished. She had one more surprise up her sleeve. And to lead this national initiative, I'm honored to introduce our new Director of National Outreach, a man who has been with New Horizons from the very beginning, who embodies the spirit of compassion and community that is at the heart of everything we do. Please welcome Mr. Franklin Holloway. The crowd gasped as Franklin made his way to the stage. He had stepped back from the public eye in recent years, focusing on his philanthropic work behind the scenes. His appearance here was unexpected but welcome. As Franklin took the microphone, his eyes twinkling with joy, Dorothy felt a wave of emotion wash over her. How far they had come from that day in the supermarket. How many lives had been changed, including her own. Franklin's speech was brief but powerful, emphasizing the importance of kindness and community in creating lasting change. As he finished, he turned to Dorothy, holding out his hand. "Ms. Manning," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the PA system, "would you do the honors?" Together, they cut the ribbon, officially reopening the supermarket. As they toured the renovated space, Dorothy found herself back at the checkout counter where it had all begun. She ran her hand along the smooth surface, remembering the young woman she had been, never imagining the path that lay ahead of her. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, Dorothy found a quiet moment with Franklin. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" she asked, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. Franklin chuckled. "Honestly, no. I had hoped to make a difference, but this has exceeded my wildest dreams, and it's all thanks to you, Dorothy." Dorothy shook her head. "Not just me. It's thanks to everyone who believed in New Horizons, who was willing to work for change. We did this together." As they stood there, watching the ebb and flow of people in the newly reopened supermarket, Dorothy felt a profound sense of gratitude for the opportunity she had been given, for the trust placed in her, for the countless individuals who had contributed to making New Horizons a reality. But most of all, she was grateful for that moment of kindness that had started it all. It had cost her a job, but it had given her a purpose. It had opened her eyes to the power of compassion, to the possibility of change. As a young cashier approached the register where they stood, Dorothy smiled warmly at her. "Remember," she said softly, "a small act of kindness can change everything. You never know where it might lead." The cashier nodded, looking slightly confused but pleased by the attention. Dorothy turned back to Franklin. "So are you ready for this new adventure?" Franklin's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "More than ready. There's still so much work to be done, so many lives to touch." As they walked out of the supermarket into the bright sunshine, Dorothy felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness had led her here to a place where she could make a real difference in the world. And as she looked out at the city, her city, she knew that this was still just the beginning. There were more horizons to explore, more lives to change, more communities to transform, and she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, because she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that compassion, when combined with determination and vision, had the power to change the world, one small act of kindness at a time. You might also like one of the 2 videos on your screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.